The autumn air was crisp that Friday evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was the kind that prided itself on manicured lawns and silence after dark, where the only sounds were the distant hum of air conditioning units and the occasional passing car. It was in this tranquil setting that everything would change in a matter of minutes. Damon Lewis pulled his modest Honda Civic to the curb outside 142 Oak Street, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. He sat for a moment checking his phone for the address his colleague had sent him earlier that day. The house before him was a typical two-story colonial, its white siding gleaming under the streetlight. This was supposed to be a simple pickup, nothing more than collecting some donated sports equipment for the high school where he taught physical education. At 38, Damon had the kind of quiet presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His athletic build spoke of years of discipline and training, though he carried himself with an understated humility that made him instantly likable to his students and fellow teachers. Tonight he wore a simple gray sweatshirt and dark jeans, his appearance casual and unassuming as he stepped out of his car. The evening was peaceful, almost serene, as Damon walked up the front path. He rang the doorbell and waited, his hands clasped behind his back, in a stance that had become second nature over the years. When no one answered after a full minute, he checked his phone again. The message was clear. "Equipment is on the back porch. Help yourself if nobody's home." Damon walked around the side of the house, his footsteps quiet on the concrete pathway. The backyard was well maintained, with a small porch that held several boxes labeled Athletic Equipment Donation. He smiled to himself, grateful for the community's generosity toward the school's underfunded sports programs. As he lifted the first box, testing its weight, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the street. Damon didn't think much of it at first. Neighborhoods like this saw plenty of evening activity as residents returned from work or went out for dinner. But something about the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching made him pause. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp, aggressive, cutting through the evening quiet like a blade. Damon turned slowly, the box still in his arms, to see a figure approaching from around the corner of the house. Even in the dim light, the silhouette was unmistakable. A police officer, hand resting on his belt, walking with the kind of swagger that suggested he owned the world. Officer Craig Morrison was everything Damon was not. Where Damon was measured and thoughtful, Morrison was brash and quick to judgment. At 42, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been seriously challenged. His pale complexion flushed red with what appeared to be anger or excitement. His uniform was pristine, every crease sharp, every button polished to a shine that caught the streetlight as he moved. "I said, what are you doing?" Morrison repeated, his voice louder now, more threatening. His right hand moved closer to his service weapon, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. Damon set the box down carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. Years of training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to think before acting, to assess threats with precision. But this wasn't a battlefield or a training exercise. This was a suburban backyard, and he was simply collecting donated equipment for his students. "Good evening, officer," Damon said, his voice steady and respectful. "I'm picking up some donated sports equipment for Jefferson High School. I'm a teacher there." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his hand now resting on his radio. "Is that so? And I suppose you have permission to be on this property?" "Yes, sir," Damon replied, reaching slowly into his pocket to retrieve his phone. "I have text messages from the homeowner giving me permission to—" "Don't move," Morrison barked, his hand snapping to his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Damon froze, his hand halfway to his pocket, his phone just inches away. The evening suddenly felt colder, the shadows longer and more threatening. "Officer, I was just trying to show you the messages that—" "I don't want to hear it," Morrison interrupted, stepping closer. "We've had reports of break-ins in this neighborhood. Young men like you think they can just take what they want." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Young men like you. Damon felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition of something he'd hoped he'd left behind in his youth. But he'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially in situations like this. "Officer Morrison," Damon said, reading the name tag on the man's uniform, "I understand your concern, but if you'll just let me show you the text messages." "Turn around and put your hands on the fence," Morrison ordered, unholstering his weapon but keeping it pointed toward the ground. "Now." Damon's mind raced. Every instinct honed by years of military training told him this was wrong, that the officer was escalating a situation that didn't warrant escalation. But he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. He turned slowly, placing his hands on the wooden fence that separated this yard from the next. Morrison approached from behind, his footsteps heavy on the grass. "Spread your legs. Wider." As Damon complied, Morrison began to pat him down roughly, his hands aggressive and invasive. "What's this?" he asked, feeling something in Damon's back pocket. "My wallet," Damon replied quietly. Morrison pulled it out, flipping it open to examine the contents. He pulled out Damon's driver's license, squinting at it in the dim light. "Damon Lewis, 432 Maple Avenue. That's across town in the projects, isn't it?" The way he said projects made it sound like a disease. Damon closed his eyes briefly, summoning his patience. "It's a perfectly respectable neighborhood, officer." Morrison chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Sure it is. So tell me, Damon, what's a guy from the projects doing in a neighborhood like this? Besides stealing, I mean." "I told you I'm here to pick up donated equipment for the school where I teach." Right, the gym teacher story." Morrison's tone was mocking now, theatrical. "Let me guess, you coach basketball too?" Damon turned his head slightly, trying to catch Morrison's eye. "Football, actually, and track and field." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Of course you do. Look, pal, I've heard every story in the book. The sob story about the poor inner-city teacher trying to help his students. It's all garbage." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about suspected theft or neighborhood security. This was about something far deeper, far more personal. Damon had encountered men like Morrison before. Men who carried their prejudices like weapons, ready to draw them at the first opportunity. "Officer, I'd really appreciate if you'd just call the homeowner. Her name is Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. She's the one who arranged for me to pick up these donations." Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Damon allowed himself to hope that reason might prevail. But when the officer spoke again, his voice was even harsher than before. "Mrs. Patterson, huh? Let me tell you something, boy. Mrs. Patterson is a pillar of this community. She's not the type to associate with people like you." The word boy hit Damon like a physical blow. He'd been called many things in his life, but that particular word, delivered with that particular venom, transported him back to a time and place he'd worked hard to leave behind. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Officer Morrison, I'm going to ask you respectfully to either verify my story or let me go. I have identification, I have the text messages, and I'm sure Mrs. Patterson would be happy to confirm that she gave me permission to be here." Morrison stepped closer, his breath hot against Damon's ear. "You know what I think? I think you're a liar. I think you saw some nice equipment sitting on a porch and decided to help yourself. I think you're just another thief who got caught." Damon's hands pressed against the fence, his knuckles white with the effort of remaining calm. Years of military discipline warred with a rising tide of anger and frustration. He thought of his students who looked up to him as a role model. He thought of the men he'd served with who had trusted him with their lives. He thought of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, potentially crumbling because of one man's prejudice. "I'm not a thief," Damon said quietly, each word carefully controlled. Morrison grabbed his shoulder and spun him around roughly, causing Damon to stumble slightly. "Don't you dare talk back to me. I'm a police officer and you'll show me some respect." For the first time, Damon allowed himself to meet Morrison's gaze directly. What he saw there was a mixture of fear and hatred, the kind of toxic combination that had fueled injustice for generations. But he also saw something else: uncertainty. Morrison wasn't as confident as he was pretending to be. "I am showing you respect, Officer Morrison," Damon said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've complied with every order you've given. I've been polite and cooperative. But what you're doing right now isn't law enforcement, it's harassment." Morrison's face turned a deeper shade of red, his eyes bulging with rage. "Harassment? You want to know what harassment looks like?" Before Damon could respond, Morrison shoved him hard against the fence. The impact sent a shock through Damon's chest, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. His military training kicked in, his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance. "Don't even think about it," Morrison snarled, his hand moving to his weapon again. "I've been looking for an excuse to use this, and you're about to give me one." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Morrison wasn't just prepared to escalate the situation, he was hoping for it. Damon forced himself to relax, to step back from the edge of a confrontation that could only end badly for him. "Officer, please," Damon said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This doesn't have to go any further. Just call Mrs. Patterson, verify my story. That's all I'm asking." Morrison studied him for a moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, without warning, he grabbed Damon's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him face first against the fence again. "You know what? I've decided you're under arrest for trespassing and attempted burglary. Maybe a night in jail will teach you some respect." As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Damon closed his eyes and tried to center himself. This wasn't the first time he'd faced impossible odds. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him or prejudged him based on the color of his skin. But it might be the first time the consequences would follow him into a courtroom. Morrison led him roughly around the house toward the patrol car, his grip unnecessarily tight on Damon's arm. "You picked the wrong neighborhood tonight, boy. This isn't the kind of place where people like you can just do whatever you want." As they reached the street, Damon noticed several neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. They watched from their porches and front yards, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Morrison seemed to relish the attention, walking slower now, making sure everyone could see the arrest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison called out to the gathering crowd, his voice theatrical and self-congratulatory. "This is what happens when criminals think they can prey on decent, law-abiding citizens. Rest assured your neighborhood is safe tonight." Damon said nothing as he was pushed into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet street. As Morrison settled into the driver's seat and began filling out paperwork, Damon stared out the window at the house, where the donated equipment still sat on the back porch, waiting to be collected. The irony wasn't lost on him. Those boxes contained volleyballs and tennis rackets, jump ropes and cones, all destined for students who had so little but dreamed so big, equipment that would help them stay active, stay engaged, stay out of trouble. Now, because of one man's prejudice and another man's pride, those students might have to wait a little longer for their chance to play. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, reporting his arrest to dispatch. "This is Unit 247. I have a suspect in custody for trespassing and attempted burglary. Black male, late 30s, claims to be a teacher, but was found stealing from a residence." Damon listened to the lies with a mixture of disgust and resignation. He'd been in worse situations before, faced greater challenges than this. But somehow this felt different. This wasn't about survival or military objectives. This was about justice, about truth, about the kind of man he'd worked his entire life to become. The booking process was a humiliating parade of procedures designed to strip away dignity. Fingerprints, photographs, property confiscation, and finally, a cell that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Damon sat on the narrow bench that passed for a bed and tried to process what had happened. In the span of 30 minutes, his life had been turned upside down. One moment he was a respected teacher and coach, picking up donated equipment for his students. The next, he was a criminal in the eyes of the law, facing charges that could destroy his career and reputation. The holding cell was small and dimly lit, with concrete walls that seemed to close in as the hours passed. Damon had been in tighter spaces before, in places far more dangerous than this, but the psychological weight of unjust imprisonment was heavier than any physical discomfort. He thought about his students who would be expecting him at practice on Monday morning. He thought about his fellow teachers who would wonder why he hadn't shown up for work. He thought about the community that had come to trust and respect him, and how quickly that respect could evaporate in the face of criminal charges. But most of all, he thought about Morrison and the casual cruelty with which the officer had destroyed his evening. The lies, the prejudice, the deliberate humiliation in front of the neighbors, it was all part of a pattern that Damon recognized but had hoped he'd moved beyond. As the night wore on and the jail settled into its routine of distant voices and clanging doors, Damon began to plan. He'd been in impossible situations before, had faced enemies who seemed insurmountable. He'd learned that victory often came not from strength or skill, but from patience and preparation. Morrison thought he'd won tonight. He thought he'd put another troublemaker in his place, reinforced the social order that kept men like him in power and men like Damon in check. But Morrison didn't know who he was dealing with. He'd seen a gym teacher from the projects and made assumptions based on prejudice and stereotypes. What Morrison hadn't seen was the man who had spent 20 years in the United States Army, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected officers in his field. He hadn't seen the leader who had commanded men in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. He hadn't seen the strategist who had planned and executed missions that saved lives and secured objectives others thought impossible. As dawn broke through the small window near the ceiling of his cell, Damon allowed himself a small smile. Morrison had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And in wars, Damon had learned, the side with better intelligence usually prevailed. The morning brought new challenges as Damon was processed for his court appearance. He was given a phone call which he used to contact Isaiah Banks, a lawyer he'd met through community work. Banks was young but had a reputation for taking on difficult cases and fighting for justice. "Damon," Banks's voice was surprised when he answered the phone. "What are you doing calling from the county jail?" "It's a long story, Isaiah. I need your help." As Damon explained the events of the previous evening, he could hear the anger building in Banks's voice. This wasn't the first case of its kind that the young lawyer had encountered, but it never got easier to hear about the casual cruelty and systematic prejudice that still plagued the justice system. "Don't worry, Damon," Banks said when the story was finished. "I'll be there for your arraignment, and Morrison picked the wrong man to mess with this time." The arraignment was a brief, formal affair. Damon stood before Judge Harold Mitchell, a white man in his 60s with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much injustice to be surprised by any of it. The charges were read aloud: trespassing and attempted burglary. Damon pled not guilty, and bail was set at $5,000. As he waited for Banks to arrange his release, Damon caught sight of Morrison in the hallway outside the courtroom. The officer was talking to the prosecutor, their heads bent close together in conversation. When Morrison noticed Damon watching, he smiled and gave a small wave, as if they were old friends meeting by chance. The message was clear. Morrison was confident, comfortable, sure that the system would protect him and punish Damon. But as Damon was finally released and walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunlight, he carried with him the knowledge that would soon turn Morrison's world upside down. Banks drove him home in silence, both men lost in thought about the battle ahead. As they pulled up to Damon's modest apartment building, the lawyer finally spoke. "Damon, I have to ask, is there anything about your background that might help us in this case? Anything that might make the jury see you differently than Morrison wants them to?" Damon looked at his friend and lawyer, this young man who was about to take on a fight that would test both their resolve. There was so much Banks didn't know, so much that nobody in this small town knew about the quiet gym teacher who had arrived 3 years ago and simply started making a difference in young people's lives. "There might be," Damon said finally. "But Isaiah, when the time comes to reveal it, we need to do it right. Morrison thinks he knows who I am, but he has no idea what he's unleashed." As they sat in the car outside Damon's building, the seeds of a strategy began to form. This wouldn't just be about proving innocence. It would be about exposing the truth. And the truth, when it finally came to light, would be more powerful than Morrison could possibly imagine. The law offices of Banks and Associates occupied the second floor of a converted brownstone in the older part of town, where rent was cheap and justice came with a payment plan. Isaiah Banks had been practicing law for only 3 years, but his reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys avoided had already made him a legend in certain circles. The office was cramped and cluttered, with law books stacked on every available surface and case files threatening to topple from overstuffed filing cabinets. But what the office lacked in elegance, it made up for in determination. This was where underdogs came to fight, where the system's failures were challenged by someone who still believed in justice. Damon sat across from Banks's desk, watching the young lawyer pace back and forth as he outlined their strategy. At 29, Banks was everything Morrison wasn't: thoughtful, passionate, and committed to truth above all else. His dark skin and earnest manner reminded Damon of some of the young soldiers he'd mentored over the years, men who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders but never lost sight of what they were fighting for. "The prosecutor is Robert Hayes," Banks said, pausing to lean against the window that looked out onto the busy street below. "He's been district attorney for 8 years, and he's never met a police officer's testimony he didn't believe. This case is going to be about more than just proving your innocence, Damon. It's going to be about exposing Morrison for what he really is." Damon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "What do we know about Morrison's history?" Banks opened a thick file and began reading from his notes. "Officer Craig Morrison, 12 years on the force. He's had 4 complaints filed against him in the past 3 years, all involving excessive force or misconduct with minority suspects. None of the complaints led to disciplinary action." "What happened to the complainants?" 2 dropped their complaints after pressure from the department. 1 left town, the 4th dot. Banks paused, his jaw tightening. The 4th was found guilty of assaulting an officer and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Morrison wasn't just a bad cop. He was a predator who had been protected by a system that valued solidarity over justice. But Damon had faced predators before, and he knew their greatest weakness was always their arrogance. "Isaiah," Damon said quietly, "I think it's time I told you who I really am." Banks looked up from his files, something in Damon's tone catching his attention. "What do you mean?" Damon reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. He placed it on the desk between them and opened it slowly, as if revealing a secret he'd kept hidden for years. The first document was a military service record, official and imposing. Banks leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages, as his expression changed from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. "You're Colonel Damon Lewis," Banks whispered, his voice barely audible. "Retired," Damon corrected. "But yes." Banks flipped through the pages, each one revealing another layer of a story he could never have imagined. Combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, commendations for valor, training records that read like a catalog of every specialized skill the military had to offer, leadership positions that put him in command of hundreds of soldiers. But it was the last document in the folder that made Banks' hands tremble slightly as he read it. It was recent, dated just 6 months ago, and it bore the seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "You're still active," Banks said, looking up at Damon with new understanding. "You're not just a retired colonel, you're the commanding officer of a joint task force." Damon nodded. "The 1st Special Operations Task Force. We specialize in counterterrorism operations and international security. When I'm not teaching high school kids how to run track, I'm briefing senators and coordinating with allies around the world." Banks sat back in his chair, the full weight of the situation finally hitting him. Morrison arrested a commanding officer in the United States military. Morrison arrested who he thought was just another troublemaker from the projects, Damon corrected. He saw what he expected to see and acted accordingly. The fact that he was completely wrong about who I am is going to be his downfall. Banks began pacing again, but now his movements were energized, purposeful. "This changes everything. When the jury learns who you really are." "No," Damon interrupted firmly. "We don't lead with this information. We save it for the right moment." "But why?" "This could end the case before it really begins." Damon stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives. "Because this case isn't really about me, Isaiah. It's about every black man who's ever been profiled by someone like Morrison. It's about every person who's been judged based on assumptions and stereotypes." He turned back to face Banks, his expression intense. "If we reveal my military background too early, the jury will focus on the fact that Morrison made a mistake about my identity. But they'll miss the larger point, that Morrison would have done the same thing to any black man he found in that situation. The crime isn't that he arrested a colonel. The crime is that he arrested an innocent man based on prejudice and then lied about it." Banks nodded slowly, beginning to understand the strategy. "So we let Morrison dig his own grave first." "Exactly. We let him tell his version of events. We let him paint me as everything he thinks I am. And then when he's committed to his lies, we reveal the truth about who I really am and watch his credibility crumble." Over the following days, Banks threw himself into preparation with the intensity of a man on a mission. He interviewed witnesses, studied police procedures, and built a timeline of events that would expose every inconsistency in Morrison's story. But his most important task was getting to know the man he was defending. Damon's apartment was modest but spotless, the home of someone accustomed to military precision. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photographs. Damon with his soldiers in the field, Damon receiving commendations from high-ranking officials, Damon in civilian clothes with groups of smiling students. Tell me about the transition, Banks said as they sat at Damon's kitchen table, preparing for his testimony. How does someone go from commanding special operations to teaching physical education? Damon smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Banks had seen from him. It's not as different as you might think. Leadership is leadership, whether you're training soldiers or coaching teenagers. Both require patience, discipline, and the ability to bring out the best in people. But why teaching? You could have done anything after retiring. Could I? Damon's expression grew more serious. Isaiah, I spent 20 years in the military because I believed in service. When I retired, I wanted to continue serving, but in a different way. These kids, especially the ones from backgrounds like mine, they need someone who believes in them. They need someone who can show them that their circumstances don't define their possibilities. Banks made notes as Damon spoke, but he was struck by the passion in the man's voice when he talked about his students. This wasn't just a job for him. It was a calling. What about your current military position, the task force you command? That's more complicated, Damon admitted. I'm officially retired from active duty, but I serve as a consultant and commander for special operations that require someone with my particular experience. It's part-time work that allows me to maintain my teaching position while still serving my country when needed. Does the school know? And it needs to stay that way. My effectiveness as both a teacher and a military commander depends on maintaining operational security. The only reason I'm telling you is because it's relevant to this case. Banks nodded, understanding the delicate balance Damon had to maintain. Morrison has no idea what he stepped into, does he? None whatsoever, and that's going to be his undoing. As the trial date approached, Banks continued to build his case, while Damon returned to his normal routine as much as possible. He taught his classes, coached his teams, and maintained the facade of a simple gym teacher dealing with an unfortunate legal situation. But beneath the surface, he was preparing for a different kind of battle. The students at Jefferson High School had rallied around their beloved coach when news of his arrest spread through the school. They organized fundraisers for his legal defense, wrote letters to local newspapers defending his character, and showed up at the courthouse during preliminary hearings to show their support. Coach Lewis is the best teacher at this school, said Keisha Robinson, a senior on the track team. He's the one who convinced me to apply for college scholarships. He stays after school to help kids who are struggling, and he uses his own money to buy equipment when the school can't afford it. The idea that he would steal anything is ridiculous. The community's support was gratifying, but Damon knew it wouldn't be enough in court. They needed evidence, strategy, and perfect execution. Most importantly, they needed Morrison to underestimate them, which, based on the officer's behavior so far, wouldn't be difficult. Morrison had been telling anyone who would listen about his arrest of the troublemaker from the projects. He'd embellished the story, with each telling adding details about Damon's supposed aggression and suspicious behavior. By the time the story made its way through the police department and into the local media, Morrison had transformed a routine equipment pickup into a dramatic confrontation with a dangerous criminal. He's cocky, Banks reported after attending a pre-trial hearing. Morrison actually smirked at me when we passed in the hallway. He thinks this is going to be easy. Good, Damon replied. Overconfidence has been the downfall of many adversaries. Let him think he's already won. The final piece of Banks' preparation involved understanding the jury they would face. The pool was predominantly white, middle-aged, and middle-class. These were people who generally trusted police officers and had little experience with the kind of systematic prejudice that men like Morrison represented. It's not going to be easy, Banks admitted during one of their final strategy sessions. We're asking them to believe that a police officer would lie under oath and that the system they trust is fundamentally flawed. People believe what makes sense to them, Damon observed. Our job is to make the truth more compelling than the lies. 2 days before the trial was set to begin, Damon received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and instantly recognizable. "Colonel Lewis, this is General Patricia Harrison. I understand you're facing some legal difficulties." General Harrison was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, one of the most powerful people in the military hierarchy. The fact that she was calling personally meant that Damon's situation had reached the highest levels of command. "Yes, ma'am," Damon replied, "but I have every confidence that the truth will prevail." "I'm sure it will. Colonel, I want you to know that you have the full support of your command. If you need character witnesses, expert testimony, or any other assistance, you have only to ask." "Thank you, General. I may take you up on that offer." "See that you do. The military doesn't abandon its own, especially not someone of your caliber and service record." After the call ended, Damon sat in his apartment, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the battle ahead. Tomorrow, he would walk into a courtroom as a defendant, accused of crimes he hadn't committed by a man who had prejudged him based on the color of his skin. But he wouldn't be walking in alone. He had Isaiah Banks, a lawyer who believed in justice more than career advancement. He had his students and community members who knew his character. He had the support of military leaders who understood his value. And most importantly, he had the truth. Morrison thought he was fighting a gym teacher from the projects. What he was actually fighting was a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to his country, who had faced down enemies in the world's most dangerous places, who had earned the respect of soldiers and commanders alike through decades of exemplary service. The trial would begin tomorrow, and with it, Morrison would learn that he had made the biggest mistake of his career. Not because he had arrested the wrong man, but because he had underestimated the power of truth and the danger of prejudice. As Damon prepared for bed, he thought about the men he had served with over the years, soldiers who had trusted him with their lives and followed him into impossible situations. They had succeeded not because they were stronger or better armed than their enemies, but because they fought for something larger than themselves. Tomorrow he would fight again, not for military objectives or national security, but for justice, dignity, and the principle that all men deserved to be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. It was a battle worth fighting, and it was one he intended to win. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as crowds began to gather for what had become the most talked-about trial in the county's recent history. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers seeking the light. Reporters checked their equipment and practiced their opening lines, while curious townspeople filled the sidewalks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Inside the imposing granite building, Courtroom 4A hummed with nervous energy. The gallery was packed with an unusual mix of spectators: high school students who had skipped classes to support their coach, community members who had followed the case in the local news, and a contingent of police officers who had come to show solidarity with their colleague. The division was stark and visible, with clear lines drawn between those who supported Damon and those who stood with Morrison. Judge Harold Mitchell entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of some ancient bird of justice. At 63, Mitchell had presided over hundreds of cases, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the media attention or the way the community had polarized around the issues involved. Whatever it was, he could sense the weight of expectation in the room. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the crowded courtroom came to its feet in unison. Damon sat at the defense table beside Isaiah Banks, his posture straight and his expression calm. He wore a simple dark suit and blue tie, his appearance modest and respectful. To most observers, he looked like exactly what Morrison claimed he was, a working-class man hoping the system would give him a fair shake. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Robert Hayes shuffled through his papers with the confidence of a man who had won more cases than he had lost. Hayes was in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-featured, with the kind of practiced authority that came from years of convincing juries that his version of events was the only one that mattered. Beside him sat Officer Morrison, resplendent in his dress uniform, every button polished to mirror brightness. Morrison looked like the very image of law and order, his jaw set in determined lines, his eyes focused straight ahead. He had spent the morning reviewing his testimony one final time, confident that his word would carry the weight it always had. After all, he was a decorated police officer with 12 years of service. His opponent was just a gym teacher with a criminal record. The state of Georgia versus Damon Lewis. Judge Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. We are here for a jury trial on charges of criminal trespass and attempted burglary. Mr. Hayes, you may proceed with your opening statement. Hayes rose slowly, straightening his tie as he approached the jury box. The 12 jurors sat in their chairs like a panel of judgment, their faces a mixture of curiosity and solemnity. They were, as Banks had predicted, predominantly white and middle class, the kind of people who generally trusted the police and had little reason to question official accounts of events. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hayes began, his voice smooth and authoritative. What you're going to hear today is a simple story about a crime that was prevented by good police work. On the evening of October 15th, Officer Craig Morrison was responding to concerns about suspicious activity in a quiet residential neighborhood when he discovered the defendant, Damon Lewis, in the process of stealing sports equipment from the backyard of an innocent homeowner. Hayes paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Now, Mr. Lewis will tell you that he had permission to be there. He'll claim that he was simply picking up donated equipment for the school where he works. But ladies and gentlemen, criminals always have stories. They always have excuses. What they don't have is the truth. The prosecutor walked closer to the jury, his expression earnest and concerned. Officer Morrison will testify that when he approached Mr. Lewis and identified himself as a police officer, the defendant became hostile and aggressive. He refused to cooperate with a lawful investigation. He physically resisted arrest. And when Officer Morrison attempted to restrain him for everyone's safety, Mr. Lewis became violent. From the gallery, a few of Damon's students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew their coach, knew his character, and nothing they were hearing matched the man who had inspired them to achieve more than they thought possible. But the jury didn't know Damon Lewis. All they knew was what they were being told by a prosecutor they were inclined to trust. This is not a complicated case, Hayes continued, returning to his table to pick up a manila folder. It's about a man who thought he could take what didn't belong to him and then lied about it when he got caught. It's about an officer who did his job exactly as he was trained to do it. And it's about holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of whatever sob story they might tell. Hayes returned to his seat with the satisfied air of a man who had just made an irrefutable argument. Judge Mitchell nodded to the defense table, and Isaiah Banks rose to address the jury. At 29, Banks looked young compared to Hayes, but there was a fire in his eyes that spoke of deep conviction. He approached the jury with the measured steps of someone who carried the weight of truth on his shoulders. Members of the jury, Banks began, his voice clear and strong. Mr. Hayes just told you that this is a simple case. He's right, but not in the way he thinks. This is indeed simple. It's the story of an innocent man who was targeted, humiliated, and arrested because of the color of his skin and the prejudices of one police officer. Several jurors leaned forward, their attention caught by the directness of Banks's accusation. In the gallery, Morrison's fellow officers shifted uncomfortably, while Damon's supporters nodded in approval. "You're going to hear testimony about what really happened that night," Banks continued, beginning to pace slowly in front of the jury box. "You're going to learn that Damon Lewis had explicit permission to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. You're going to discover that he cooperated fully with Officer Morrison's initial questions, and you're going to find out that Officer Morrison escalated a routine encounter into an arrest based not on evidence, but on assumptions." Banks paused, making eye contact with each juror in turn. "But most importantly, you're going to learn who Damon Lewis really is. Not the caricature that Officer Morrison and the prosecution want you to see, but the real man. A man whose character and service to his community speak louder than any false accusations ever could." The young lawyer returned to his seat, and Judge Mitchell addressed the prosecution. "Mr. Hayes, call your first witness." The state calls Officer Craig Morrison. Morrison rose from his chair with theatrical precision, every movement calculated to project authority and competence. He walked to the witness stand with the swagger of a man who owned the room, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. As he took the oath, his voice was strong and clear, the voice of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Hayes approached the witness stand, his manner deferential and respectful. "Officer Morrison, please tell the jury about your experience in law enforcement." "I've been a police officer for 12 years, Morrison replied, his tone professional and measured. "I've received commendations for my service and have made hundreds of arrests. I take my duty to protect and serve the community very seriously." "And what were you doing on the evening of October 15th? Morrison settled back in his chair, his posture confident. "I was on patrol in the Oakwood Heights neighborhood when I received a call about suspicious activity. A concerned citizen had reported seeing someone lurking around residential properties." This was the first lie, and Banks made a note on his legal pad. The police dispatch records would show no such call had been made. "What did you observe when you arrived in the neighborhood?" "I saw the defendant, Mr. Lewis, on the back porch of 142 Oak Street. He was removing items from the property and loading them into boxes. His behavior was furtive and suspicious." Morrison's voice took on a theatrical quality as he warmed to his story. "When I approached and identified myself as a police officer, his demeanor immediately changed. He became hostile and uncooperative." "In what way?" "He refused to answer my questions directly. When I asked what he was doing there, he gave evasive answers. When I asked for identification, he became argumentative and challenged my authority to question him." Banks watched the jury as Morrison spoke, noting how some nodded along with the officer's account. They wanted to believe him. Police officers were supposed to be the good guys, the ones who protected them from the chaos of the world. Accepting that Morrison might be lying would mean acknowledging that the system they trusted was flawed. "What happened next, Officer Morrison?" "I attempted to de-escalate the situation by calmly explaining that I needed to verify his identity and his reason for being on the property. But Mr. Lewis became increasingly agitated. He raised his voice and took an aggressive stance." Morrison demonstrated by squaring his shoulders and clenching his fists slightly. "At that point, I became concerned for my safety. Mr. Lewis is a large man, and his behavior was threatening." "Did you feel threatened enough to call for backup?" "I should have," Morrison replied, shaking his head as if regretting his decision. but I thought I could handle the situation on my own. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story, but Morrison delivered it with such conviction that several jurors nodded sympathetically. Tell the jury what happened when you attempted to detain Mr. Lewis. Morrison's expression grew darker, more serious. When I told him he was under arrest, he physically resisted. He pushed me away and attempted to flee. During the struggle, he tried to grab my service weapon. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, Damon's students looked shocked and confused. This wasn't the man they knew, wasn't the teacher who preached discipline and respect. You're saying the defendant attempted to take your gun? Yes, sir. He made a deliberate grab for my holster. At that point, I had no choice but to use necessary force to subdue him and protect myself. Morrison's performance was masterful, his voice conveying just the right mixture of professionalism and genuine concern. He was painting Damon as a dangerous criminal who had forced him into a confrontation he'd tried to avoid. Was Mr. Lewis injured during this altercation? Slightly. There was some minor bruising when I had to restrain him, but I used only the minimum force necessary to ensure everyone's safety. Hayes nodded gravely. Officer Morrison, in your 12 years of experience, have you ever encountered a situation quite like this one? Morrison appeared to consider the question carefully. Not exactly like this, no. Most people, when they're caught doing something they shouldn't be doing, either run or surrender. Mr. Lewis seemed to think he could intimidate me into letting him go. He was wrong. Thank you, Officer Morrison. No further questions. As Hayes returned to his seat, Banks rose for cross-examination. The young lawyer moved slowly, deliberately, his expression thoughtful rather than aggressive. He'd learned early in his career that attacking a police officer's testimony too aggressively could backfire with juries. Officer Morrison, Banks began, his tone respectful but probing, you testified that you received a call about suspicious activity. Do you recall who made that call? Morrison hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. I don't recall the specific caller's name, but you do remember receiving the call? Yes, of course. Banks walked to his table and picked up a document. Officer Morrison, I have here a copy of the dispatch log from October 15th. Would it surprise you to learn that no calls about suspicious activity in the Oakwood Heights neighborhood were logged that evening? The courtroom fell silent. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. Dispatch logs aren't always complete. Sometimes calls come through different channels. What other channels? Direct radio communication, cell phone calls to officers in the field. There are several ways citizens can contact law enforcement. Banks nodded as if accepting the explanation, but several jurors looked skeptical. Let's talk about what you observed when you arrived at the scene. You said Mr. Lewis was behaving in a furtive and suspicious manner. Can you be more specific? He was moving quickly, looking around nervously. Classic signs of criminal behavior. Is it possible that he was simply trying to load heavy equipment efficiently? I've seen enough criminals to know suspicious behavior when I see it. Banks paced in front of the witness stand, his hands clasped behind his back. Officer Morrison, you testified that my client became hostile when you questioned him, but isn't it true that he simply asked why you needed to see his identification? He challenged my authority. By asking a question, Morrison's face was reddening slightly, by refusing to cooperate with a lawful investigation. But asking, why do you need to see my ID, isn't refusing to cooperate, is it? It's simply asking for clarification. Hayes started to rise with an objection, but Judge Mitchell waved him back down. He was being uncooperative, Morrison insisted. Banks nodded and moved to a different line of questioning. Officer Morrison, you carry a body camera, don't you? Yes, all officers in our department are equipped with body cameras. And was your body camera recording during this incident? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Unfortunately, the camera malfunctioned that evening. Malfunctioned how? It stopped recording. Technical problems happen sometimes. Banks retrieved another document from his table. According to the maintenance logs for your equipment, your body camera has never malfunctioned before. It's only 18 months old. And has a perfect service record. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? Morrison's jaw clenched visibly. Like I said, technical problems happen. They certainly do, Banks agreed, his tone suggesting he didn't believe a word of it. Officer Morrison, you testified that my client tried to grab your service weapon. Where exactly did this alleged attempt occur? During the struggle, when I was trying to handcuff him. And you're certain he was reaching for your gun, not just trying to break free from your grip? I know the difference between resistance and attempted disarming. Banks approached the witness stand more closely. Officer Morrison, isn't it true that you escalated this encounter from the very beginning? That you saw a black man in a white neighborhood and immediately assumed he was up to no good? I don't see color, Morrison replied stiffly. I see suspicious behavior. Really? Then why did you refer to my client as boy during the arrest? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Morrison's face went pale, then flushed red. I never said that. No, we'll see about that. Banks returned to his table, leaving Morrison visibly shaken on the witness stand. Officer Morrison, one final question. Are you familiar with Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the owner of the property where you arrested my client? I know of her. She's a respected member of the community. Have you spoken with Mrs. Patterson about the events of that evening? Morrison hesitated. No, I haven't. Isn't that unusual? Wouldn't you normally want to interview the property owner in a case like this? The evidence was clear. Mr. Lewis was trespassing and attempting to steal property. But you never verified that with the actual property owner. Morrison's silence spoke volumes. Banks nodded to Judge Mitchell. No further questions. As Morrison stepped down from the witness stand, his earlier confidence had evaporated. His testimony had been full of holes, and Banks had expertly exposed several inconsistencies. But the real battle was just beginning. Hayes called two more witnesses, a neighbor who claimed to have seen suspicious activity and a police detective who had processed the scene. Both testimonies were brief and added little to the prosecution's case, but they served to reinforce the narrative that Damon was a criminal who had been caught in the act. When the prosecution rested its case, Judge Mitchell called for a recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Banks huddled with Damon, discussing strategy for the defense presentation. How do you think it's going? Damon asked. Better than expected, Banks replied. Morrison's testimony was full of holes, and the jury noticed. But we can't get overconfident. We need to present our case perfectly. Damon nodded, his expression calm despite the circumstances. I'm ready, Isaiah. Let's show them who I really am. As they prepared to return to the courtroom, neither man could have predicted how dramatically the trial was about to change. The prosecution had told their story, painted their picture of events. Now it was time for the defense to reveal the truth, and the truth was more powerful than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom as Judge Mitchell called the court back to order. The gallery had filled even more during the recess, with several new faces appearing among the spectators. Word was spreading throughout the community that something significant was happening in courtroom 4A, and people were coming to witness it firsthand. Isaiah Banks stood at the defense table, his expression calm but determined. The morning had gone well, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. Morrison's testimony had been shaky under cross-examination, but convincing a jury that a police officer had lied under oath was never easy. What Banks was about to do would either vindicate his client completely or backfire spectacularly. "Mr. Banks," Judge Mitchell said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "you may call your first witness." Banks took a deep breath, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just the outcome of this trial, but possibly the trajectory of Damon's entire life. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Patterson." A murmur ran through the courtroom as an elderly white woman made her way slowly to the witness stand. Mrs. Patterson was exactly what Central Casting would have ordered for the role of respectable community matron. Silver-haired, well-dressed, with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of a lifetime of civic involvement and social responsibility. At 72, Eleanor Patterson had lived in Oakwood Heights for over 40 years. She had served on the school board, organized charity drives, and was widely respected as a pillar of the community. If anyone's word would carry weight with this jury, it was hers. After taking the oath, Mrs. Patterson settled into the witness chair with the composed manner of someone accustomed to public speaking. Banks approached her with a respectful demeanor, knowing that her testimony could be the foundation upon which the entire defense was built. "Mrs. Patterson, do you know the defendant, Damon Lewis?" "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "Mr. Lewis is a teacher at Jefferson High School. He coaches several sports teams there." "And how did you come to know Mr. Lewis?" Mrs. Patterson smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth the courtroom had seen all day. "My late husband left behind a considerable amount of sports equipment from his coaching days. When I heard that the high school's athletic program was struggling with funding, I contacted the school to offer a donation. Mr. Lewis was the person they sent to coordinate the pickup." Banks nodded, making sure every word was clearly heard by the jury. "And did you give Mr. Lewis permission to come to your property on the evening of October 15th? "Absolutely. We had exchanged several text messages about the timing. I told him that if no one answered the door, the equipment would be on the back porch, and he was welcome to take it." The impact of her words was immediate and obvious. Several jurors sat up straighter, while others glanced toward Morrison with expressions of confusion and growing suspicion. "Mrs. Patterson, did you report any suspicious activity to the police that evening?" "Certainly not. There was no suspicious activity to report. Mr. Lewis was doing exactly what I had asked him to do." Banks walked to his table and retrieved a phone, holding it up for the jury to see. "Mrs. Patterson, are these the text messages you exchanged with Mr. Lewis?" "Yes, those are the messages." Banks handed the phone to the bailiff, who passed it to the jury. As they read the messages, their expressions ranged from surprise to anger. The messages clearly showed that Damon had permission to be on the property and that Mrs. Patterson had specifically told him to take the equipment from the back porch if she wasn't home. "Mrs. Patterson, have you ever had any reason to distrust Mr. Lewis or question his character?" "Never. He has always been polite, professional, and reliable. The idea that he would steal anything is absolutely ridiculous." Hayes rose for cross-examination, but his usual confidence seemed shaken. Mrs. Patterson was not the kind of witness prosecutors enjoyed challenging, especially when her testimony was so clear and compelling. "Mrs. Patterson," Hayes began cautiously, "isn't it possible that Mr. Lewis could have been taking more than you authorized?" "No, it's not possible," she replied firmly. "I watched him load the equipment from my kitchen window. He took exactly what I had set aside for donation, nothing more." Hayes tried a different approach. "But you weren't outside during the arrest. You don't know what happened between Mr. Lewis and Officer Morrison." "I know what I saw. Mrs. Patterson said, her voice growing stern. "I saw a police officer treating a good man badly for no reason other than the color of his skin." The bluntness of her statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Here was a respected white community leader directly accusing a police officer of racial bias. Hayes quickly ended his cross-examination, clearly hoping to limit the damage. But Mrs. Patterson's testimony had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the trial. The prosecution's entire case was based on the premise that Damon was trespassing. Now the jury knew he had explicit permission to be there. "The defense calls Keisha Robinson," Banks announced. Keisha was an 18-year-old senior at Jefferson High School, a member of the track team that Damon coached. She walked to the witness stand with the nervous energy of someone who had never been in a courtroom before, but was determined to do right by her coach. "Miss Robinson, how long have you known Mr. Lewis?" 3 years. He's been my coach since I was a sophomore." "And what kind of coach is he?" Keisha's nervousness disappeared as she began talking about her coach. "He's the best teacher I've ever had. He doesn't just coach us in sports, he helps us with our schoolwork, talks to us about college, and makes sure we stay out of trouble." "Can you give the jury a specific example?" "Last year, my mom lost her job and we couldn't afford new running shoes. Coach Lewis bought them for me with his own money. He said every athlete deserved proper equipment to compete." Keisha's voice grew stronger as she continued. "He does stuff like that all the time. He uses his own car to drive kids to meets when the school bus isn't available. He stays after practice to help kids with their homework. He's like a father to a lot of us." Banks let her words sink in before asking his next question. "Miss Robinson, in the 3 years you've known Coach Lewis, have you ever seen him lose his temper or become violent?" "Never. Coach Lewis is the calmest person I know. Even when we mess up or don't try our hardest, he never yells. He just talks to us about doing better." "What about when dealing with difficult situations?" "There was this time when some guys from another school were calling us names during a meet, really bad names. Some of our team wanted to fight, but Coach Lewis handled it. He talked to their coach and got it stopped without anyone getting in trouble. He always says, violence never solves anything." Hayes's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Keisha's genuine affection for her coach was obvious, and any attempt to shake her testimony only made her more convincing. Banks called 3 more students, each with similar stories of Damon's character and dedication. Their testimony painted a picture of a man completely different from the dangerous criminal Morrison had described. These weren't coached responses or rehearsed statements. They were genuine expressions of respect and gratitude from young people whose lives had been touched by their teacher. The final student witness was Jerome Washington, a 19-year-old who had graduated the previous year and was now attending college on a track scholarship. "Mr. Washington, tell the jury about your relationship with Coach Lewis." Jerome straightened in his chair, his voice filled with emotion. "Coach Lewis saved my life. I was heading down a bad path, hanging with the wrong crowd, about to drop out of school. He pulled me aside one day and told me I had potential. He worked with me after school every day, helped me bring my grades up, and taught me discipline." "And what happened as a result?" "I got a full scholarship to State University. I'm studying engineering now, something I never thought was possible. None of it would have happened without Coach Lewis believing in me when no one else would." Banks nodded. "Mr. Washington, based on your experience with Coach Lewis, do you believe he would steal sports equipment from a community member?" Jerome actually laughed at the question. "Coach Lewis gives away equipment. He doesn't steal it. The man has probably spent thousands of dollars of his own money helping kids who needed gear they couldn't afford." After Jerome's testimony, Banks announced that the defense would call one final witness. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Your Honor, the defense calls Colonel Damon Lewis. The use of the military title sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Several jurors sat up straighter, while Morrison visibly paled at the prosecution table. Hayes looked confused and concerned, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected title. Damon rose from the defense table with the measured precision that had become second nature during his military career. As he walked to the witness stand, his bearing was unmistakably that of a soldier, straight-backed, purposeful, commanding without being arrogant. Several people in the gallery, including some of Morrison's fellow officers, leaned forward to get a better look at this man they thought they knew. After taking the oath, Damon settled into the witness chair with the same calm presence he had maintained throughout the trial. But now there was something different about him, a sense of authority that seemed to fill the room. Banks approached his client with the reverence due to both a friend and a military hero. Sir, please state your full name and occupation for the jury. My name is Colonel Damon Marcus Lewis, United States Army. I am currently the commanding officer of the 1st Special Operations Task Force, and I serve as a physical education teacher at Jefferson High School. The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison stared at Damon with an expression of growing horror as the full implications of what he'd done began to sink in. Hayes shuffled through his papers frantically, looking for any reference to Damon's military service that he might have missed. Colonel Lewis, how long have you served in the United States Army? 22 years of active duty, plus my current position as a reserve commander. Banks walked to his table and retrieved a thick folder, holding it up for the jury to see. Colonel, I have here your military service record. Can you summarize your career for the jury? Damon's voice was steady and professional as he recounted a career that read like a catalog of American military excellence. Multiple combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, command positions of increasing responsibility, special operations training in counter-terrorism, hostage rescue, and intelligence gathering, commendations for valor, leadership, and service above and beyond the call of duty. Colonel Lewis, what is the 1st Special Operations Task Force? It's a joint military unit that coordinates counterterrorism operations and international security missions. We work with intelligence agencies, foreign military units, and special operations forces from all branches of the armed services. And you command this unit? Yes, I report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and brief senior military and civilian leadership on matters of national security. The courtroom was absolutely silent as the full weight of Damon's identity settled over everyone present. Morrison had arrested not just an innocent man, but a high-ranking military officer whose responsibilities included protecting the very freedoms and security that Americans took for granted. Colonel Lewis, why didn't you reveal your military background when Officer Morrison arrested you? Damon turned slightly to look directly at Morrison, his gaze steady and unwavering. Because my military rank was irrelevant to the situation. I was on that property as a civilian, as a teacher, collecting donated equipment for my students. The fact that I also serve my country in uniform should not determine whether I'm treated with basic respect and dignity. Banks nodded. But surely if Officer Morrison had known who you were, if Officer Morrison had treated me with the respect due to any citizen, regardless of my background, none of this would have happened. Damon interrupted quietly. The problem isn't that he didn't know I was a colonel. The problem is that he assumed I was a criminal based on the color of my skin. Several jurors were now looking at Morrison with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. The officer who had seemed so confident that morning now appeared to be shrinking in his chair. Colonel Lewis, please tell the jury in your own words, What happened on the evening of October 15th? Damon's testimony was precise, detailed, and completely different from Morrison's account. He spoke of being approached aggressively, of trying to show his permission to be on the property, of being physically handled and verbally abused. His description of Morrison calling him boy drew audible gasps from the gallery. At any point during this encounter did you threaten Officer Morrison or attempt to take his weapon? Absolutely not. My military training taught me to de-escalate conflicts whenever possible. I remained calm and cooperative throughout the encounter, even as Officer Morrison became increasingly aggressive and hostile. Why didn't you inform Officer Morrison of your military rank during the arrest? Damon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I shouldn't have needed to. Every American citizen, regardless of their race or background, deserves to be treated with dignity by law enforcement. If I had pulled rank, it might have ended the situation, but it wouldn't have addressed the underlying problem, that Officer Morrison profiled me based on prejudice, not evidence. Banks walked closer to the jury box. Colonel Lewis, you've commanded men in combat situations. You've faced enemies who wanted to kill you. How would you compare the stress of combat to what you experienced during your arrest? Damon considered the question seriously. In combat, you know who your enemies are. You understand the rules of engagement. There's honor in the fight, even when it's dangerous. What happened to me that night was different. It was being judged and attacked by someone who was supposed to protect me based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudice. In some ways, that was more difficult to handle than enemy fire. The power of his words was evident in the faces of the jurors. Several were clearly moved, while others looked angry at the injustice Damon had endured. Hayes rose for cross-examination, but his usual aggressive approach was clearly inappropriate given the witness's stature and service record. He tried to focus on technical details and timelines, but every question only served to highlight Damon's credibility and Morrison's lack of it. Colonel Lewis, isn't it true that you could have avoided this entire situation by simply identifying yourself as a military officer? Mr. Hayes, are you suggesting that only military officers deserve respectful treatment from police? That civilians should expect to be harassed and arrested without cause? Hayes quickly moved on, but the damage was done. His questions only made Damon appear more reasonable and Morrison's actions more inexcusable. After Hayes concluded his cross-examination, Banks stood for redirect. Colonel Lewis, one final question. Despite everything you've been through, everything Officer Morrison put you through, do you regret not revealing your military rank that night? Damon looked out at the packed courtroom, his gaze taking in the students who had supported him, the community members who had rallied to his cause, and finally settling on Morrison himself. No, I don't regret it, because this case isn't about me. It's about every person who doesn't wear a uniform, who doesn't have rank or status to protect them. It's about the principle that justice should be blind, that all citizens deserve equal treatment under the law. If I had avoided this situation by pulling rank, Officer Morrison would still be out there, targeting other innocent people who don't have the protection I have. As Damon returned to his seat, the transformation in the courtroom was complete. What had begun as the trial of a gym teacher accused of theft had become something much larger, a referendum on justice, equality, and the abuse of power. Morrison sat at the prosecution table looking like a man who had just realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his career. He had arrested and humiliated not just any citizen, but a decorated military hero whose service record was beyond reproach. The implications for his career, his reputation, and his freedom were beginning to sink in. But the trial wasn't over yet. Banks had saved his most devastating evidence for last. and Morrison's humiliation was about to become complete. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as Isaiah Banks prepared to deliver what he hoped would be the final blow to the prosecution's case. The revelation of Damon's true identity had shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. But Banks knew that dramatic revelations alone wouldn't guarantee victory. He needed evidence, documentation, and most importantly, he needed to expose the complete scope of Morrison's deception. Judge Mitchell called for the final phase of testimony, and Banks stood with the confidence of a man who held all the winning cards. The gallery was now packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Word had spread through the community like wildfire. The gym teacher was actually a decorated military colonel, and the police officer who had arrested him was about to face a reckoning. "Your Honor," Banks announced, "the defense would like to introduce additional evidence that will demonstrate the complete fabrication of Officer Morrison's testimony." Hayes started to object, but Judge Mitchell waved him down. "I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Banks." Banks walked to his table and retrieved a manila envelope, holding it up for the jury to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here are records that Officer Morrison hoped would never see the light of day. Records that show this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of misconduct that has been covered up for years." The first document Banks presented was Morrison's personnel file, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. As he read from the file, a picture emerged of an officer who had been the subject of multiple complaints, all involving encounters with minority suspects, all dismissed or buried by the department. In 2019, Banks read, Marcus Johnson filed a complaint alleging that Officer Morrison used excessive force during a traffic stop. Mr. Johnson claimed that Morrison called him racial slurs and physically assaulted him without provocation. The complaint was dismissed without investigation. Banks continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each case. In 2020, Denise Williams reported that Officer Morrison illegally searched her vehicle during a routine traffic stop, claiming to smell marijuana when no drugs were found. Her complaint was also dismissed. The pattern was clear and damning. Morrison had been targeting minority citizens for years, confident that the system would protect him from consequences. But now, in the bright light of a public courtroom, his actions were being exposed for all to see. Morrison sat at the prosecution table, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. The confident officer who had taken the stand that morning was gone, replaced by a man who could see his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes. "But, Your Honor," Banks continued, "the most damaging evidence hasn't been presented yet." Banks walked to the back of the courtroom where a young woman in her 20s sat holding a smartphone. She stood and made her way to the witness stand, her presence causing a murmur of curiosity throughout the gallery. The defense calls Ashley Jenkins. As Ashley took the oath, Banks explained her relevance to the case. Miss Jenkins lives in an apartment building across the street from where Colonel Lewis was arrested. On the evening of October 15th, she witnessed the entire encounter and recorded part of it on her phone. The impact of this revelation was immediate. Hayes shot to his feet, his face red with anger. The courtroom froze as Hayes tried to object. "Your Honor, if the defense had video evidence, it should have been disclosed during discovery." Judge Mitchell raised a hand, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Hayes, I will allow this testimony if the defense can prove the recording is authentic and relevant. Proceed, Mr. Banks." Banks turned to Ashley with a reassuring smile. "Miss Jenkins, can you tell the court where you were on the evening of October 15th? Ashley adjusted the microphone nervously. "I live across from Mrs. Patterson's house. My balcony overlooks her backyard. That night, I was sitting outside scrolling my phone when I heard shouting. I saw Officer Morrison approach Mr. Lewis. Something about the way he was acting made me start recording. Why did you decide to record? Because I've lived here my whole life and I've seen things swept under the rug before. I thought if anything happened, there should be proof. Banks nodded, then turned to the bailiff. Would you please play the video for the court? The lights dimmed slightly as the screen came to life. The grainy footage showed Damon standing calmly with his hands visible. Morrison's voice barked through the speaker. Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't move. The jury leaned forward as the video captured Damon's steady reply. Officer, I have permission from Mrs. Patterson. I have text messages that will prove it. Then came the words that silenced the room. Shut up, boy. I know your type. Always stealing, always lying. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Jurors exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. The phrase Morrison had denied using in testimony now rang out clearly in his own voice. And the video showed Damon never lunged, never reached for a weapon. He stood calm and compliant even as Morrison shoved him against the fence. When the clip ended, the silence was deafening. Banks let the weight of the evidence hang in the air before speaking. Miss Jenkins, did you alter this video in any way? No, sir. It's exactly what I recorded that night. I sent a copy to the local paper too, but they ignored me. Said they didn't want to run anything against the police without official confirmation. Banks turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard Officer Morrison deny ever using racial slurs. You have heard him describe my client as aggressive, violent, and threatening. This video proves that none of that was true. It proves that Officer Morrison lied under oath, and it proves that Colonel Lewis was the calm, cooperative citizen he has always been. Hayes sputtered, trying to salvage ground. Your Honor, this is one person's video taken from across the street. We can't even be sure the audio. Judge Mitchell cut him off sharply. Mr. Hayes, the authenticity of this recording is not in doubt. It corroborates multiple witness statements, and the officer's own voice is unmistakable. Sit down. Morrison looked like a man drowning, his face drained of all color. The jurors, once skeptical, now regarded him with open contempt. The image of a trusted protector had been shattered, replaced by the undeniable evidence of prejudice and abuse of power. Banks stepped back to the defense table, his voice steady but resonant. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even when people try to bury it. Colonel Lewis stood here and told you he wasn't guilty. Mrs. Patterson, his students, and now this recording all confirm it. The prosecution's case has collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Justice demands only one verdict. When closing arguments were finished, the jury retired. They were gone less than an hour. We, the jury, find the defendant, Damon Marcus Lewis, not guilty on all charges. The gallery erupted in cheers and applause, restrained only by Judge Mitchell's gavel. Damon remained composed, though a flicker of relief passed across his face as he shook Isaiah Banks's hand firmly. But the reckoning wasn't over. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his tone grave. This court will not ignore what we have witnessed. Officer Morrison, perjury is a crime. I am ordering an immediate review of your testimony and conduct. You may be seated for now. The once proud officer now looked like a broken man, staring down at his polished shoes as the reality of his downfall set in. Outside the courthouse, Damon's students surrounded him, chanting, "Coach Lewis." Reporters pressed microphones toward him, but Damon spoke only one sentence. This victory isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who believes that justice must apply equally to all. The sun dipped low as Damon walked away from the courthouse, flanked by his students and his lawyer. He was no longer just a teacher, no longer just a colonel. He had become something greater, living proof that truth, though battered, could still prevail. And Officer Morrison, His name would soon be etched not in honor rolls, but in disciplinary hearings and criminal investigations. The reckoning had arrived, and it had left no doubt. The uniform doesn't make the man, character does.